A blade flashed in the Roman Senate on the Ides of March. Julius Caesar fell, and with him died the old republic. But what truly forges a legend from a life? Is it the territory conquered, the laws written, or the unanswered questions that swirl like dust around a tomb? By the end of this journey, you will peer behind the marble statues to understand the real people and profound mysteries that define ancient power. We will venture from the sands of Egypt to the mountains of Persia, investigating leaders whose brilliant minds planned empires and whose shocking deaths became historical cliffhangers. Why did the world's greatest conqueror vanish into a tomb we still cannot find? How did a ruthless warrior become history's greatest messenger of peace? This is not a list of dates, but a detective story spanning millennia. What do you believe is the ultimate legacy of a leader? He was born into a world of faded glory and brutal politics. Rome was a republic in name, but in reality, it was a playground for a handful of wealthy families locked in a perpetual, vicious struggle. The young Gaius Julius Caesar belonged to one of these ancient noble lines, but his family had little money and even less current influence. His childhood was defined by danger, living through the bloody purges of the dictator Sulla, who ordered the boy's own execution. Caesar fled into hiding, a teenage fugitive learning his first brutal lesson about Roman power. It was not given, it was taken. This early brush with annihilation forged a survivor, a man who understood that in Rome you either climbed to the very top or you were crushed beneath the wheels of ambition. His climb was a masterclass in political theater and calculated risk. He spent lavishly on public games, putting himself deeply into debt to buy the people's love. He cultivated a reputation for incredible personal endurance, sharing every hardship with his soldiers on campaign, and he formed a secret, earth-shaking alliance known as the First Triumvirate. This was not an official government body, but a private deal between three men: the wildly wealthy Crassus, the brilliant General Pompey, and Caesar himself. Together, they bypassed the Senate and controlled the Republic. Caesar's share of the bargain was the governorship of Gaul, modern-day France. It was here, far from the intrigue of Rome, that he truly built his legend. For nearly a decade, Caesar waged war in Gaul. His commentaries, part military report and part propaganda, chronicled his campaigns not just as conquests, but as a civilizing mission bringing Roman order to barbarian chaos. He was a tactical genius, employing rapid movement, clever engineering, and psychological warfare. But the Gallic Wars were also staggeringly brutal, with historians estimating hundreds of thousands killed or enslaved. The wealth and glory that flowed back to Rome, however, made Caesar a hero to the common people and a terrifying rival to the conservative nobles in the Senate. His command was set to expire, and his enemies demanded he return to Rome as a private citizen, vulnerable to prosecution. Caesar stood on the banks of the Rubicon River, the boundary of his province. To cross it with his army was an irrevocable declaration of war against the Roman state itself. "The die is cast," he reportedly said, and he crossed. What followed was a civil war that tore the Republic apart. He chased his former ally Pompey across the Mediterranean, culminating in a decisive victory. Returning to Rome victorious, Caesar began to act not as a first among equals, but as a king in all but name. He was appointed dictator for life, a title that sounded the death knell for the old aristocratic republic. Yet his rule was not merely one of tyranny. He launched sweeping reforms, settling his veterans on land, revising the chaotic Roman calendar into one very similar to what we use today, and granting citizenship to provinces outside Italy. He pardoned his old enemies, a move he saw as magnanimous, but they saw as humiliating. Here lies the core of the mystery. Was Caesar a visionary reformer, a necessary force to update a broken system, or was he a power-hungry autocrat who destroyed centuries of tradition? The aristocracy believed they knew the answer. On the Ides of March, they struck not as assassins in the shadows, but as self-proclaimed liberators in the very heart of the state. In killing the man, they hoped to kill the idea, but as we will see, they only succeeded in making the idea and the man immortal. This pattern of a leader's dramatic end forever sealing their legend is one we will see again, starting with a conqueror whose final journey is one of history's greatest vanishing acts. The Ides of March is history's most famous murder mystery, but the crime scene details are shockingly clear. We know the place, the Roman Senate's temporary chamber at the theater of Pompey. We know the time, mid-afternoon on March 15th. We even know many of the 60 conspirators by name. At the center of the plot stood two men, Gaius Cassius Longinus and Marcus Junius Brutus. Cassius was the fiery, resentful architect of the conspiracy, a man who had served under Caesar but never forgiven him for a perceived lack of honor. Brutus was the reluctant, tragic symbol. He was a staunch traditionalist, a descendant of the man who drove out the last king of Rome 5 centuries earlier, and Caesar himself was rumored to be his biological father. Their stated motive was noble, even heroic, to save the Roman Republic from a tyrant and restore the power of the Senate and the people. They called themselves the Liberators. But was their cause so pure? Many of the senators who plunged their daggers into Caesar that day were men he had personally pardoned after the Civil War. Their freedom, their wealth, their very lives were gifts from the man they now killed. This suggests a powerful undercurrent of bitter jealousy and wounded pride. They could not bear living in the shadow of his mercy or competing in a political arena he now dominated completely. The assassination was preceded by a cascade of ominous warnings that have become legendary. A soothsayer famously told Caesar to beware the Ides of March. His wife Calpurnia dreamed of his statue running with blood. Even the night before, he reportedly saw a vision of flying above the clouds and shaking the hand of the god Jupiter. Did he ignore these signs out of arrogant belief in his own destiny, or from a philosophical acceptance of fate? The historical record paints a picture of a man who, on that morning, felt unwell and considered staying home. Yet he was persuaded by one of the conspirators to attend, who argued that the Senate planned to grant him a magnificent new title that day. In a final, chilling detail, as Caesar took his seat, a conspirator grabbed his purple toga, the signal for the attack. The first blow was a shallow cut to the neck. Caesar turned, shocked, and fought back until he saw Brutus among the attackers. Then, according to the ancient sources, he pulled his robe over his face and fell, pierced by 23 wounds. His body lay at the foot of a statue of his old rival Pompey. The liberators had struck down the tyrant, but in doing so, they created a vacuum of power more terrifying than any one man. They had no plan for what came next, believing the Republic would simply spring back to life. Instead, they unleashed a new cycle of civil war and ultimately the very imperial rule they sought to prevent. The death of Caesar is the ultimate historical cliffhanger, a single violent act that changed everything, leaving us to wonder if he had heeded the warnings. Could the Roman Republic have been saved, or was its fate already sealed? The assassin's daggers did not kill Caesar's influence, they unleashed it. In the chaotic power vacuum that followed, a new figure emerged from the shadows, a sickly 18-year-old whom Caesar had named in his will as his adopted son and heir, Gaius Octavius. To the seasoned generals and politicians of Rome, he seemed a mere boy, a political pawn. They gravely underestimated him. Renaming himself Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, he wielded his great-uncle's name like a weapon, instantly claiming the loyalty of Caesar's veterans and the masses. What followed was a dizzying series of alliances and betrayals. Octavian first allied with Caesar's loyal lieutenant Mark Antony to hunt down the liberators. After their victory, the two men, alongside a lesser general, divided the Roman world in a second triumvirate, a far bloodier and more official version of the first. Their purge of political enemies was systematic and ruthless. Then the inevitable clash between the partners came. Octavian, the master of political propaganda in Rome, painted Antony as a traitor seduced by the Eastern queen Cleopatra. Their war culminated in the naval battle of Actium, and with their subsequent suicides, Octavian stood alone. He faced a profound dilemma. The Republic was dead, killed as much by decades of civil strife as by Caesar's ambition. Yet the Roman people still cherished its ideals. Octavian's genius was not in winning a war, but in winning the peace. He did not call himself king or dictator. Instead, in a breathtaking act of political theater, he pretended to restore the Republic, surrendering his extraordinary powers to the Senate. The Senate, of course, promptly gave them back, along with a new, sacred title, Augustus, the Revered One. He became the first citizen, the princeps, a monarch in republican clothing. The Roman Empire was born not with a coronation, but with a carefully staged performance of humility. And at the heart of this new system was a name, Caesar. It ceased to be just a family name and transformed into a title, a symbol of imperial power itself. Every emperor that followed, whether related by blood or not, was called Caesar. This title echoed far beyond the fall of Rome. In the Germanic lands, it became Kaiser. In the Slavic world, it became Tsar. For 2,000 years, the name Caesar was synonymous with supreme authority, a direct linguistic thread back to that ambitious noble from a crumbling republic. But his legacy is not confined to politics and power. It lives vividly in our stories. William Shakespeare, centuries later, would immortalize the tragedy in his play Julius Caesar, giving us timeless phrases like "Beware the Ides of March" and the heartbreaking line, "Et tu, Brute." Shakespeare captured the eternal human drama of the event, the clash of idealism and ambition, loyalty and betrayal. In countless books, films, and even modern political discourse, Caesar remains the ultimate archetype of the charismatic leader who crosses the line, the man who destroys a system to save it or to rule it. So we are left with a haunting question. Did the liberators fail because they were poor statesmen, or because they were trying to kill a ghost, an idea of one man's power that had already escaped into the world, waiting for the next leader to give it a name and a face? The story of power's transformation did not end in Rome. It began centuries earlier in the rugged highlands of Macedonia with a king who would make the very concept of empire global. Alexander III, known to history as Alexander the Great, was a force of nature wrapped in human form. His father, King Philip II, was a military genius in his own right, who forged Macedonia's army into an invincible professional machine and unified the quarrelsome Greek city-states under his control. For Alexander, Philip was both a towering example and a shadow to escape. Their relationship was a volatile mix of admiration and fierce rivalry. Philip secured Alexander's future by hiring the greatest mind in the Greek world, the philosopher Aristotle, to tutor his son. For 3 years, the teenage prince absorbed lessons in science, medicine, and philosophy, developing a lifelong love for Homer's Iliad and a belief in a universal human excellence. This education gave him not just knowledge but a sense of cosmic destiny. When Philip was assassinated, the 20-year-old Alexander inherited not just a kingdom, but the finest army in the world and his father's bold plan to invade the colossal Persian Empire. He would execute that plan with a speed and brilliance that defied belief. His first major battle in Asia at the Granicus River was a daring, personal charge across the water that nearly cost him his life but shattered the Persian satraps. At Issus, he faced the Persian king Darius III himself, and through tactical genius, turned a numerically superior force into a routed mob, capturing the king's family. The final, definitive blow came at Gaugamela on a dusty plain in modern-day Iraq. Darius had prepared the ground, leveling it for his chariots and scythed wheels, and assembled a vast host from across his empire. Alexander, outnumbered perhaps 5 to 1, executed a masterful feint, drawing the Persian line out of position before leading his elite companion cavalry in a thunderous charge straight at the heart of the enemy, aiming directly for Darius. The great king fled and his empire crumbled. In just a few years, Alexander had conquered lands stretching from Greece to Egypt and deep into modern Afghanistan and Pakistan. But his true ambition was becoming clear. He was not merely a conqueror, he sought to be a unifier. He began adopting Persian dress and customs, encouraging his officers to marry Persian noblewomen, and integrating Persian soldiers into his army. This policy of fusion enraged his proud Macedonian veterans, who saw it as a betrayal of their culture. Was Alexander a visionary, trying to weave a new, blended world from the threads of East and West? Or was this the act of a megalomaniac, intoxicated by his own success and adopting the trappings of a god-king? The questions multiplied with his every move. He pushed ever eastward, seeking the edge of the world, until his exhausted army finally refused to go further. The return journey was a descent into tragedy. In Babylon, after a sudden fever following a prolonged banquet, Alexander the Great, the unconquered conqueror, died. He was 32 years old. He left no clear heir, only a pregnant wife and a sprawling empire ruled by his generals. His body, destined for burial in Macedonia, was hijacked and taken to Egypt, becoming a lost relic. And so, the ultimate mystery of Alexander is not just how he lived, but how he died and what vanished with him. Was his death from natural causes, the result of battle wounds, poison, or even the deadly waters of the river Styx, as some ancient rumors suggested? More importantly, if he had lived another 20 years, could his fragile dream of a united world have held? Or was it always destined to shatter into fragments, leaving only the blinding echo of his name? Alexander the Great died in a fevered haze in Babylon, and with his last breath he ignited a historical firestorm. The cause of his death is one of antiquity's greatest unsolved cases, with competing theories each pointing to a different, darker story. The official account, recorded by royal diaries, suggests a natural illness, perhaps malaria or typhoid fever, worsened by a previous lung injury and the exhaustion of a decade of relentless campaigning. This is the simplest explanation, a great man worn down by his own superhuman efforts. Yet from the very beginning, whispers of foul play swirled through the palace corridors. The poisoning theory is the most dramatic. Suspicion fell on his generals, the Diadochi, men like Ptolemy and Seleucus who stood to carve up his empire. A slow-acting poison, perhaps derived from the toxic Styx River in Greece, could explain the prolonged, agonizing decline. Others looked to his inner circle, even his Bactrian wife, Roxana, who was pregnant with his only legitimate heir. In the cutthroat world of succession, eliminating Alexander could secure a regency for her unborn child. Then there is the theory of self-destruction, that a profound depression after the death of his closest companion, Hephaestion, led him to drown his grief in wine, and that a final, massive drinking bout triggered a fatal bout of pancreatitis or a perforated ulcer. Each theory reflects a different facet of the legend. Was he a victim of nature, of treacherous ambition, of a broken heart, or of his own monumental excess? The mystery deepens with the lost days that followed. His body did not begin to decompose for an entire week, a detail some took as a sign of his divinity, and others saw as evidence of a sophisticated poison that preserved the corpse. This period was a vacuum of power, a tense silence where his generals secretly negotiated the fate of the world before announcing his death to the restless army. The fate of his physical remains only added to the myth. His wish was to be buried at the Oracle of Siwa in Egypt, but his body became the ultimate political prize. Ptolemy, one of his most cunning generals, hijacked the magnificent funeral cortege and took the body to Egypt, first to Memphis, then to the city Alexander himself had founded, Alexandria. There, the conqueror was placed in a golden sarcophagus within a magnificent tomb, the Sema. For centuries, it was a site of pilgrimage for Roman emperors from Augustus to Caracalla, who would visit to pay respects and perhaps seek a fraction of his legendary power. Then, sometime after the 4th century, the tomb vanished from history. Was it destroyed in riots, swallowed by an earthquake, or simply lost beneath the sprawling modern city? Despite numerous searches, it has never been found. This final disappearance feels profoundly symbolic. Alexander's empire fragmented, his dynasty snuffed out within a generation, and even his bones were taken by the sands. Yet, by leaving no grave, he achieved a different kind of immortality. He became a ghost that haunts history, a figure forever just out of reach, his story unfinished because his final chapter, his resting place, remains a blank page. This pattern of a lost tomb sealing a legend is not unique. It finds a startling parallel in another land, where a different kind of leader sought not to conquer the world, but to unify it under a radical idea of peace. The golden sarcophagus that once held Alexander was more than a tomb. It was a pilgrimage site for the powerful. For centuries after his death, the great and the ambitious journeyed to Alexandria to stand before it. Julius Caesar, during his own Egyptian campaign, paid his respects, perhaps contemplating the sheer scale of Alexander's legacy. The unstable Roman Emperor Caracalla was so obsessed he not only visited but reportedly took Alexander's ring and tunic for himself. These documented visits placed the tomb, known as the Soma or Sema, firmly within the royal quarter of ancient Alexandria for hundreds of years. Then, the historical trail goes cold, likely between the late 3rd and 4th centuries, a period of riots, earthquakes, and rising sea levels that transformed the city's landscape. The exact cause of its disappearance is a mystery in itself. Was it deliberately hidden, destroyed in a religious conflict, or simply swallowed by the Mediterranean coast? This vanishing act launched the greatest archaeological treasure hunt in history. Modern searches have focused on a few key areas within Alexandria. Some theories point to the Nabi Daniel Mosque, built atop layers of ancient ruins. Others suggest the Latin Cemetery or a site near the city's ancient crossroads. More speculative locations have been proposed far beyond Egypt's borders, like the oasis of Siwa, or even a hidden tomb in Macedonia, though these lack strong historical support. The challenge is immense. Modern Alexandria is a dense, bustling metropolis built directly over its ancient predecessor. Excavation is like performing surgery in a living patient, requiring immense resources, permissions, and luck. Finding Alexander's tomb would be a discovery on par with Tutankhamun's, but with profound differences. While Tutankhamun showed us the sealed world of pharaonic Egypt, Alexander's tomb would be a time capsule of the Hellenistic age, the blended global culture he helped create. It could contain not just Macedonian artifacts, but Persian, Egyptian, and Indian treasures, a physical map of his fused empire. His sarcophagus might hold clues to his appearance, his health, and perhaps even the true cause of his death. But its enduring elusiveness is what truly fuels the legend. Each failed search adds to the myth, suggesting that some secrets are meant to stay buried, or that the conqueror who sought the edge of the world achieved a final, perfect escape from the grasp of history itself. Alexander's dream of a fused world died with him, but the idea of a single ruler bridging east and west did not. It found its most dramatic and final expression in a woman who was not a conqueror but a defender, fighting to save her ancient kingdom with every weapon she possessed. Cleopatra VII was the last active pharaoh of Egypt, and her story is the ultimate Game of Thrones. She was born into the Ptolemaic dynasty, a Greek family that had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, yet she was the first of them to actually learn the Egyptian language. This was not a sentimental gesture, it was a calculated political masterstroke. She presented herself to her people not as a foreign occupier, but as the living incarnation of the goddess Isis, a divine queen in the ancient tradition. Her path to power was paved with family betrayal, The Ptolemaic court was famously vicious, a nest of siblings marrying and murdering one another for control. Cleopatra initially ruled jointly with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, but was soon driven out by his advisors. Exiled, she did not wait passively. When Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria pursuing his rival Pompey, she saw her chance. The legendary tale of her being rolled into the palace inside a carpet is likely true, a brilliant piece of theater that delivered her, alone and unarmed, directly to the most powerful man in the Roman world. It was a daring gamble that paid off spectacularly. Caesar restored her to the throne, and their alliance became both political and personal, producing a son they named Caesarion, Little Caesar. For Cleopatra, this was the perfect fusion, a child who could one day rule both Egypt and Rome as a true heir to two worlds. After Caesar's assassination, she faced chaos once more. She aligned herself with Mark Antony, one of the three men vying for control of Rome. Their partnership was again a deep political and romantic bond. Together, they envisioned a grand Eastern empire to rival Rome, with Alexandria as its capital. Cleopatra funded Antony's campaigns, and in return, he granted her vast territories, declaring her and her children the rulers of lands that had once belonged to the Ptolemaic Empire. In Rome, this was painted not as strategy but as scandal. Octavian's propaganda machine portrayed Antony as a man bewitched, who had abandoned Roman virtue for an Eastern temptress. The final act was a tragic clash of empires and narratives. At the Battle of Actium, Cleopatra's fleet was present, and when she sailed her ships away, Antony famously broke his battle line to follow her. Whether this was a strategic withdrawal or a fatal moment of passion is still debated. What is certain is that Octavian spun it as proof of Antony's enslavement to a foreign queen. Defeated and cornered in Alexandria a year later, the couple chose their own ends. Antony fell on his sword. Cleopatra, according to the ancient accounts, allowed herself to be bitten by a venomous asp, a symbol of divine royalty in Egypt. Her death was not a surrender but a final, controlled act of sovereignty. She chose to die as a pharaoh on her own terms rather than be paraded through Rome in Octavian's triumph. Her intelligence, her linguistic prowess, her mastery of spectacle and symbol, all were deployed in a single, desperate campaign to preserve Egyptian independence against the inexorable tide of Roman expansion. In that, she failed, but in crafting her own legend, she succeeded so completely that we still struggle to see the shrewd monarch behind the myth of the doomed lover. Her story forces us to ask, was she the last defender of a dying world, or the first casualty of a new imperial age where even the most brilliant ruler could not stand against the legions of Rome? The legend of Cleopatra's death is a masterpiece of her own design. After the disaster at Actium, she and Mark Antony retreated to Alexandria, not in despair but to prepare a final, desperate stand. They fortified the city and even attempted to drag their ships across the isthmus to the Red Sea, a plan born of sheer defiance. When Octavian's forces finally closed in, Antony's remaining troops and navy deserted him. Believing a false report that Cleopatra had already taken her own life, he fell upon his sword but died slowly in her arms within her sealed mausoleum. Now Cleopatra was alone, the last Ptolemy, imprisoned by the man who would become Augustus. She knew her fate was to be paraded in chains through the streets of Rome, a living trophy in his triumph. This was a humiliation she would never accept. The ancient historians, writing under Augustus's rule, tell us she arranged for a basket of figs to be delivered within which hid a venomous asp. She allowed the snake to bite her on the arm, dying a painless, noble death followed by her two handmaidens. It is a perfect, poetic end, the pharaoh joining the gods on her terms. But the facts unravel this neat story. An Egyptian cobra is large, often over 6 feet long, and aggressive. It could not have been hidden so easily. Its venom causes a gruesome, painful death, not a serene slumber. Roman guards were posted at a door, and they reported no screams, only finding the 3 women dead. This has led to alternative theories. Perhaps she used a hidden poison, a toxic ointment, or a sharp pin dipped in a potent toxin, a method far more discreet and reliable than a temperamental snake. So why did Octavian, her captor, promote the asp legend? It served his purposes perfectly. It painted Cleopatra's death as exotic, dramatic, and ultimately feminine, a final act of passion rather than political defiance. It overshadowed the uncomfortable truth that he had driven a queen to suicide, and it safely contained her story as a tragic romance, not a rallying cry for Egyptian resistance. Her death was more than a personal tragedy. It was the closing of an epoch. With her, the 300-year line of the Ptolemies ended. Egypt, the last surviving kingdom of Alexander's fragmented empire, was annexed. The Hellenistic age, that vibrant blend of Greek and Eastern cultures, was over. Egypt became the personal breadbasket of the Roman emperor, a province so valuable it was governed not by senators but by knights directly loyal to Augustus. Cleopatra's calculated gamble to save her kingdom by aligning with Roman power had failed utterly, but in her final act she seized control of the one thing left, her own myth, ensuring that the story of her end would be debated for millennia longer than the Roman province she left behind. Cleopatra chose her final act, but the stage itself has vanished. 2,000 years later, her tomb, and that of Mark Antony, remains one of archaeology's most tantalizing missing pieces. The ancient biographer Plutarch provides our only real clue, writing that Octavian allowed the lovers to be buried together in a magnificent tomb, but he frustratingly neglects to say where. For centuries, scholars assumed they must lie somewhere beneath the modern sprawl of Alexandria, perhaps near the lost tomb of Alexander. But a bold new theory has shifted the search to a windswept site 30 miles west of the ancient capital, the temple complex of Taposiris Magna. Here, a Dominican lawyer turned archaeologist, Dr. Kathleen Martinez, has dedicated nearly 2 decades of her life to a single, compelling hunch. She reasoned that Cleopatra, the master of religious symbolism who presented herself as the goddess Isis, would never have been interred in a common royal cemetery. Isis was the wife of Osiris, the god of the underworld, whose body was said to be scattered and then resurrected. Taposiris Magna means the great tomb of Osiris. Could Cleopatra, identifying with Isis, have chosen this sacred ground as the final resting place for her own Osiris, Mark Antony, and ultimately herself? The excavations at Taposiris have yielded a series of breathtaking finds that, while not yet the tomb itself, suggest something extraordinary was happening there. Teams have uncovered a vast, intricate network of tunnels stretching beneath the temple, a feature typical of royal burial complexes. They have found alabaster heads believed to depict Cleopatra and Mark Antony, along with coins bearing her unmistakable profile and mummies with gilded coverings, indicating they were individuals of the highest status. Most strikingly, they discovered a tunnel leading from the temple toward the Mediterranean, a possible symbolic pathway for the soul's journey. The work is slow, painstaking, and dangerous, with the constant threat of tunnel collapses and flooding from the nearby sea. Yet each season brings new chambers and clues. Finding the tomb would be far more than just locating royal bones. It would be a direct window into the very fusion Cleopatra championed. How would a Ptolemaic queen of Greek descent and a Roman general have been laid to rest? Would their burial goods blend Egyptian religious artifacts with Roman military insignia? The tomb's art and inscriptions could finally tell us in their own words how they viewed their union, not as a scandalous affair, but as a political and divine partnership. It would rewrite the final chapter written by their Roman conquerors. This enduring search, this refusal of the sand to give up its secret, is what keeps Cleopatra's legend from becoming mere history. She remains an active mystery, a queen still waiting just out of sight for us to find her. Far from the Mediterranean's blue waters, in the fertile valleys of ancient China, a different kind of unification was being forged through fire and iron. The Warring States period was a 2-century-long nightmare of 7 rival kingdoms locked in perpetual, bloody conflict. From this chaos emerged the ruler of the state of Qin, a young king who would not just win the war but end the very idea of it. His name was Ying Zheng, and he would become Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China. His philosophy was not one of blending cultures but of absolute control. He adopted a harsh governing doctrine called legalism, which held that people were inherently selfish and could only be ruled through strict, clear laws and severe, uniform punishments. Under his command, the Qin state became a perfectly tuned war machine, its society organized for one purpose: conquest. One by one, the 6 other states fell. By the year 221 BC, the conquest was complete. For the first time in history, the lands we now call China were united under a single, central authority. But winning the peace was a task even more monumental than winning the war. The newly conquered territories spoke different dialects, used different money, wrote with different characters, and even had wagon axles of different widths, making travel and trade between regions nearly impossible. Qin Shi Huang's solution was a breathtaking campaign of standardization. With imperial decrees, he mandated a single national script so a document written in one former kingdom could be read in another. He created a unified system of currency, circular coins with a square hole in the middle. He standardized weights, measures, and even the axle widths for carts, so every road in the empire could bear the same vehicles. He connected his domains with a vast network of roads and canals, binding the empire together with literal lines of communication and control. To defend his new realm from northern nomadic tribes, he ordered the walls built by earlier states to be joined and fortified, creating the first, primitive version of the Great Wall, a project of such staggering scale and human cost that it would echo in legend for millennia. He was a builder, a unifier, an organizer of unparalleled vision. Yet this vision was enforced with terrifying brutality. He ordered the burning of books he deemed subversive, especially those of Confucian scholars who preached of a past golden age, and he reportedly had hundreds of scholars buried alive for criticizing his rule. He sought not just to control the present, but to erase competing versions of the past and future. This obsession with permanence and legacy reached its ultimate expression not in the world of the living, but in his preparations for the world of the dead. For decades, he commanded the construction of a necropolis so vast it was a mirror of his earthly empire, centered on a tomb mound beneath which, ancient texts claim, rivers of mercury flowed through a map of his kingdom under a ceiling of pearls representing the stars. And standing guard over this subterranean universe was his most silent and spectacular legion, an army forever frozen in time. The emperor's most profound legacy lies not in his wall but in his silence. For over 2,000 years, the heart of his necropolis, the main burial mound of Qin Shi Huang, has remained sealed, a forbidden capsule of his absolute power. Our most detailed account comes from the grand historian Sima Qian, writing a century after the emperor's death. He describes a subterranean palace of unimaginable luxury, where craftsmen built crossbow traps set to automatically fire at any intruder. He writes of a vast map of the empire with its rivers and seas replicated in flowing mercury, mechanically circulated to mimic the tides. The ceiling, he says, was inlaid with pearls to form the constellations, while the floor depicted the geography of the land. For centuries, this was dismissed as fantastical legend, a symbolic story rather than a physical reality. Then, modern science listened to the earth. In the 1980s, Chinese archaeologists conducted extensive scientific surveys of the tomb mound. They took soil samples from across the site and found something astonishing. Mercury levels in the earth were significantly and persistently higher than in the surrounding area, with a concentrated pattern that some researchers believe mirrors the layout of ancient China's waterways. This scientific evidence suggests Sima Qian's account was not mere myth, but based on a terrifying, tangible truth. The tomb likely does contain vast quantities of liquid mercury, a substance the ancients believed could confer immortality but we know as a deadly, volatile neurotoxin. This presents the central, paralyzing dilemma for archaeologists today. The technical challenges are immense. How do you safely excavate a structure that may be riddled with mechanical traps and flooded with toxic metal? But the ethical questions run even deeper. Current preservation technology may not be adequate to protect the organic treasures that could be inside, such as silks, wooden artifacts, or even the emperor's remains. Opening the tomb could lead to irreversible damage, a repeat of the rapid decay seen in some early Chinese tombs when exposed to modern air, so the mound remains untouched, a monument to restraint. Within it could lie the ultimate treasures of the Qin dynasty, perhaps even the emperor himself, preserved in his Mercury Sea. But it also holds the potential for disaster, an archaeological Pandora's box. This makes it the greatest sealed secret in history, a perfect echo of the first emperor's own nature, offering the promise of ultimate knowledge guarded by the threat of absolute peril. Rome's nightmares had a name, and it was Hannibal Barca. While emperors built walls and tombs, this Carthaginian general became something far more terrifying to the Roman psyche, a ghost that could not be exorcised. His story begins not in Italy, but in the sun-baked markets of Carthage, a wealthy maritime power in North Africa, locked in a life-or-death struggle with the rising Roman Republic. This was the Punic Wars, a clash of civilizations for control of the Mediterranean. Hannibal's father, Hamilcar Barca, had fought in the First War and forced his young son to swear an eternal oath of hatred toward Rome. That oath would define a life. By the age of 26, Hannibal commanded Carthaginian forces in Spain, and he conceived a plan of breathtaking audacity. He would not wait for Rome to come to him. He would carry the war to the very heart of Italy, but to get there, he would have to accomplish the impossible. He marched his army, which included 37 African war elephants, from Spain through hostile Gaul and up to the icy barrier of the Alps. The crossing is the stuff of legend, a monumental feat of sheer will. His men, and more tragically his elephants, struggled through narrow, treacherous paths, ambushed by local tribes and battered by early winter storms. Historians still debate the exact route, but the result is undeniable. After 2 weeks of brutal ascent and descent, Hannibal emerged into northern Italy with a force halved by hardship, but with his legend and Rome's terror fully intact. He had an army where no enemy army should be. What followed was a masterclass in psychological and tactical warfare. At the Trebia River, he used the cold December waters and hidden cavalry to crush a larger Roman force. At Lake Trasimene, he orchestrated a perfect ambush in the fog, slaughtering thousands and leaving the waters choked with Roman dead. But his masterpiece was Cannae. On a blistering August day in 216 BC, Hannibal faced a Roman army nearly twice the size of his own on a wide, open plain. The Roman commanders, confident in their overwhelming numbers, planned a simple, massive frontal assault to bulldoze through his center. Hannibal anticipated this. He arranged his infantry in a crescent with his weakest troops at the center. As the Roman legions pushed forward, the crescent slowly bent inward, drawing the Romans deeper into a pocket. At the critical moment, Hannibal's elite African infantry on the wings turned inward, and his cavalry, having routed the Roman horse, closed the trap from behind. The Roman army was packed so tightly that soldiers could not raise their swords. It was not a battle, it was systematic annihilation. By day's end, perhaps 50,000 Romans lay dead on that field, a loss of life that would haunt the Republic for generations. With this victory, the road to Rome itself lay open, undefended, and here we reach the great, enduring mystery of Hannibal. He did not march. Why? His cavalry commander, Mahabal, famously said that Hannibal knew how to win a victory but not how to use it. Ancient sources suggest he lacked the siege equipment necessary to breach Rome's massive walls, and his army was weary and far from supply. Perhaps he hoped his devastating victories would shatter the Roman alliance system, causing Italy's subject cities to rise up and join him, breaking Rome's power without a final, risky assault. That rebellion never came in sufficient force, so Hannibal remained in Italy, a phantom army living off the land, undefeated in battle yet unable to strike the final blow for over a decade. Rome, refusing to face him directly again, adopted a strategy of delay and attrition, gradually reconquering territory while launching an attack on Carthage itself. This forced Hannibal to return home to defend his city, where he finally met defeat at the Battle of Zama at the hands of the Roman general Scipio Africanus. Exiled and hunted, he would later take his own life rather than be captured by Rome. Yet in defeat, his legend only grew. For centuries afterward, Roman parents would tell their misbehaving children that Hannibal was at the gates. He became the ultimate external threat, the brilliant adversary against whom Rome measured its own resilience. His ghost forced the Republic to adapt, to endure, and ultimately to expand, proving that sometimes a civilization is forged not by its heroes, but by the terrifying shadow of the one enemy it could never quite forget. Hannibal's war ended at Zama, but his life became a different kind of campaign. The man who had brought Rome to its knees was now a liability to a Carthage desperate for peace. The treaty with Rome explicitly demanded his surrender. Instead, he turned to politics, becoming a chief magistrate in his broken city, and attempted to reform its corrupt government to pay off the crushing war indemnity. His enemies, both in Carthage and in Rome, accused him of plotting a new war. The truth was simpler: Rome could never sleep soundly while the man who crossed the Alps still drew breath. Forced to flee, he began a 16-year exile, a ghost drifting through the courts of Rome's eastern enemies. He served as a military advisor to King Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire, urging him to strike at Italy itself while the Romans were distracted elsewhere. Antiochus ignored the advice and was soundly defeated. Hannibal fled again, his knowledge a prized but cursed commodity, eventually finding refuge with King Prusias of Bithynia, a minor ruler in what is now northern Turkey. Even there, his shadow loomed large. Roman envoys discovered his whereabouts and demanded his extradition. Cornered in his seaside villa, the old general found himself surrounded. The ancient sources tell us he had long carried poison in a ring, a final contingency for this exact moment. Rather than let Rome parade him in chains, he chose his own end, declaring, "Let us relieve the Romans of their long anxiety." He drank the poison and died around the year 183 BC, far from the Carthaginian sun. Yet even this definitive act is shrouded in doubt. Some later historians suggested he was murdered on the orders of Prusias, who sought to curry favor with Rome. Others proposed the poison was not in a ring, but in a cup offered by a treacherous servant. The core truth remains: Rome's obsession haunted him to his final breath, proving that his greatest weapon was not his elephants, but the sheer, unshakable fear he planted in the heart of an empire. That fear transformed into a strange, enduring respect. His tactical genius, especially the double envelopment at Cannae, became textbook. Centuries later, military academies would study his maneuvers, and figures like Napoleon would model their own strategies on his campaigns. He endures as the ultimate archetype of the brilliant underdog, the commander who uses wit, terrain, and audacity to defy a superior force. His legacy asks a piercing question: does true greatness lie in ultimate victory, or in fighting so ingeniously that even your conquerors are forced to admit your mastery and to study your ghost for generations to come? Rome's greatest enemy chose poison over chains, but in another empire, a king would discover a different kind of power. In the wake of Alexander the Great's fragmented legacy, a new dynasty rose in the Indian subcontinent, the Mauryan Empire. By the year 268 BC, it was ruled by a young monarch named Ashoka, a name that would come to mean without sorrow, yet his early reign was defined by it. Grandson of the empire's founder, Ashoka was a prince forged in the brutal politics of succession, emerging victorious from a fratricidal struggle for the throne. As emperor, he pursued a path familiar to rulers of his age: expansion through raw military might. His dominion already stretched across much of the Indian landmass, but one kingdom in the east remained defiant, a prosperous coastal region called Kalinga. Around the year 261 BC, Ashoka marched his vast army to subdue it. The Kalinga War was not a mere battle, it was a cataclysm. Ancient sources describe a river of blood and a landscape of unimaginable suffering. 100,000 soldiers were slain on the battlefield, and many times more civilians perished from the violence and famine that followed. 150,000 people were taken captive. Ashoka stood victorious on a field of absolute carnage, the master of a silent, broken land. The shock of this victory was the catalyst for one of history's most profound personal transformations. The story goes that walking among the corpses, the emperor was approached not by a minister but by a Buddhist monk. The monk's serene presence amidst the horror posed a silent, devastating question. "What have you done?" In that moment, the conqueror saw not glory but the true cost of his ambition. The experience shattered him. He underwent a radical conversion, renouncing violence and embracing the teachings of Buddhism. He called this new path Dhamma or Dharma, a universal moral law of piety, compassion, truthfulness, and non-violence. But Ashoka was not content with a private spiritual change. He launched a public welfare revolution etched in stone. He ordered his new philosophy to be carved onto pillars and rock faces across his vast empire, from the mountains of Afghanistan to the jungles of southern India. These Ashokan edicts were not declarations of conquest but of conscience. They promoted respect for all life, urging restraint in the slaughter of animals for royal kitchens. They called for tolerance among all religious sects. They established medical treatments for humans and animals alike, and planted shade trees and dug wells along roads for travelers. He appointed special officers, the Dhamma Mahamatas, whose sole duty was to promote this ethical code and ensure the welfare of the people, including the elderly and prisoners. The mystery is as staggering as the change itself. How does a man raised in a culture of royal violence and hardened by the brutal calculus of power undergo such a complete reversal? Was it genuine spiritual awakening, or a brilliant political strategy to unify a diverse and restive empire through a shared ethical framework rather than sheer force? The evidence suggests it was both. His edicts show a deep personal remorse, yet they also reveal a shrewd ruler who understood that a stable empire needed more than fear. It needed a moral foundation. His legacy is immense. He sent his own children, a monk and a nun, as missionaries to spread Buddhism across Asia, to Sri Lanka, Central Asia, and possibly even the Hellenistic kingdoms to the west. Through these efforts, a once minor Indian sect was transformed into a major world religion. The Ashokan pillar, crowned with its 4 lions, remains the national emblem of India today. Yet after his death, his pacifist empire faded within decades, unable to withstand the pressures of invasion and internal strife. This raises a haunting final question. Did Ashoka's radical embrace of peace ultimately weaken his dynasty's ability to survive? Or did he achieve a different, more lasting victory by proving that an emperor's true conquest could be over his own heart, and that his most enduring monument could be an idea carved not just in rock, but in the conscience of a civilization? Ashoka's empire of conscience was written in stone, but for centuries the stones themselves kept their secrets. His vast network of pillars and rock edicts, inscribed with his messages of Dhamma, stood silent across the Indian landscape, their Brahmi script forgotten by time. They became mere curiosities, sometimes worshipped by local villagers as sacred objects, their true author and message utterly lost. The key to unlocking this ancient voice arrived in the form of a brilliant and determined British scholar, James Prinsep. In the 1830s, as an officer of the Asiatic Society in Calcutta, Princeps was obsessed with deciphering the unknown scripts found on coins and pillars. He worked with meticulous patience, comparing inscriptions from distant sites like Delhi and Allahabad. The breakthrough came when he realized that a recurring set of characters at the beginning of each text was not a prayer but a title, a name, Divanampiya Piyadasi, which translates to beloved of the gods, he who looks with affection. This was not a mythical figure but a historical king. By cross-referencing this title with the ancient Buddhist chronicles of Sri Lanka, the truth finally emerged. The benevolent king of the edicts was none other than Ashoka, the mighty Mauryan emperor. Princeps had not just deciphered a script, he had resurrected a conscience from the ruins of history. The world could now read, in Ashoka's own words, his profound regret for the Kalinga War and his detailed vision for a moral society. This rediscovery was a seismic event, revealing a ruler whose ideals seemed startlingly modern. Yet this revival of his voice only deepens the central mystery. If Ashoka was so powerful and his advocacy so sincere, why did Buddhism, the faith he championed, decline in its Indian homeland within centuries of his death? His patronage had indeed sparked a golden age, sending missionaries far and wide and convening councils to unify the doctrine. But several forces worked against its permanent dominance. Brahmanical Hinduism, the ancient Vedic tradition, was deeply woven into the social and cultural fabric of India. It proved remarkably resilient and adaptable, gradually reabsorbing Buddhist ideas and followers. Furthermore, later Mauryan rulers after Ashoka may not have shared his fervor, and without the immense state support he provided, Buddhist institutions became vulnerable. The final blow likely came with the collapse of the Mauryan Empire itself, roughly 50 years after Ashoka's passing. The subsequent fragmentation of political power and the rise of new dynasties that patronized Hinduism or other sects left Buddhism without its powerful protector. As for Ashoka's own bloodline, it vanishes into the historical mist. The later Mauryas are shadowy figures, and the dynasty ended with a coup by its military commander, Pushyamitra Shunga, who is traditionally said to have persecuted Buddhists. The direct lineage of the philosopher king, the children he sent out as missionaries, left no lasting imperial mark in India. But in a beautiful twist of historical irony, Ashoka's most visible legacy found a home in the nation that rediscovered him. When modern India gained independence, it sought symbols that represented unity in diversity, non-violence, and ancient heritage. The search ended at Sarnath, where Ashoka had erected a pillar marking the site of the Buddha's first sermon. The pillar's capital, featuring 4 majestic lions standing back to back on a base carrying the wheel of moral law, was chosen. This lion capital of Sarnath became the national emblem of the Republic of India. The wheel at its base, the Ashoka chakra, was placed at the center of the Indian flag. So the emperor who conquered with the sword and then renounced it, whose dynasty crumbled and whose favored faith receded, achieved a different kind of immortality. His symbol now watches over the world's largest democracy, a permanent stone reminder that the most enduring power a leader can wield is not over territory, but over the human aspiration for a better world. The lion capital of Ashoka stands as a symbol of conscience, but in the very heart of Rome, another emperor's legacy is etched in fire. Nero Claudius Caesar ascended the throne as a boy of 16, and for his first 5 years, the Roman Empire experienced what historians call the Golden Quinquennium, the 5 good years. His rule was guided by his tutor, the philosopher Seneca, and the Praetorian prefect Burrus. This early period was surprisingly moderate, even enlightened. Taxes were reduced, corruption was curbed, and the young emperor showed a genuine interest in the arts and public entertainment for the common people. He seemed a promising, cultured ruler. Then the descent began, a spiral so dramatic it would brand his name forever as a synonym for decadence and madness. The pivotal moment was the Great Fire of Rome in the year 64. For 6 devastating days, flames consumed 10 of the city's 14 districts. Ancient sources describe Nero watching the inferno from a safe distance, reciting epic poetry about the fall of Troy. The rumor, immortalized by the historian Tacitus, spread like the fire itself, that the emperor had ordered the city torched to clear land for a lavish new palace complex he desired, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House. To deflect this monstrous accusation, Nero needed a scapegoat. He found one in a small, misunderstood sect, the Christians. Tacitus records that a vast number of them were arrested, convicted not so much for the fire but for their hatred of humanity. Their executions were turned into public spectacles of horrific cruelty, some crucified, others sewn into animal skins and torn apart by dogs, still others set ablaze as human torches to illuminate Nero's gardens at night. This persecution is the first official Roman action against Christians, creating a martyrdom that would shape the faith's identity forever. But the fire was not the beginning of his personal horrors. Years earlier, Nero had grown weary of his domineering mother, Agrippina the Younger, the very woman who had schemed to place him on the throne. After failed attempts to drown her in a collapsible boat, he finally succeeded in having her murdered in her villa. The ancient biographer Suetonius paints a grotesque scene, claiming Nero later examined her corpse, remarking on her beauty. His personal life became a theater of excess, his artistic pretensions a source of scandal for the aristocratic class. He performed publicly as a singer, lyre player, and charioteer, roles considered deeply shameful for a Roman emperor. He spent the treasury on his Golden House, a sprawling urban villa with a colossal statue of himself and a rotating dining room ceiling. To the Senate, this was the ultimate humiliation, a ruler who preferred the applause of the masses to the dignified council of Rome's elites. So we must confront the central mystery through the fog of history. Was Nero truly a psychotic tyrant, or a complex figure maligned by the very aristocracy whose power he challenged? Our main sources, Tacitus and Suetonius, wrote decades after his death, under emperors who had every reason to blacken Nero's name to legitimize their own rules. They relied on senatorial gossip and the official records of Nero's enemies. Could the fire have been a tragic accident that Nero, an amateur dramatist, simply observed in a state of poetic awe, only to be accused of arson by a populace desperate for a villain? His persecution of Christians, while brutal, was a politically expedient move to restore order, a tactic used by many leaders. His artistic pursuits, though shocking to traditionalists, may have been a genuine, if misguided, attempt to connect with the common people over the heads of the Senate. Yet the weight of the evidence, even accounting for bias, is staggering. The murder of his mother, the execution of his first wife, the purges of perceived rivals, all point to a man increasingly unmoored from reality, believing himself above all law and tradition. His final act seals the legend. Abandoned by all, he fled Rome and with help from a servant took his own life, lamenting, "What an artist the world is losing in me." The question endures, did the Senate create the monster Nero to justify their revolt? Or did their revolt finally reveal the monster that was always there, hiding behind the lyre and the laurel wreath? The legend of Nero fiddling while Rome burned is a perfect historical lie. The instrument itself is an anachronism. The fiddle would not exist for over 1,000 years. The story, immortalized by later historians, is a metaphor that stuck, painting the emperor as a callous artist tyrant more concerned with his muse than his burning people. But what really happened in those 6 apocalyptic days in July of 64? The fire began in shops near the Circus Maximus, spreading with terrifying speed through the city's narrow, timber-lined streets. Ancient sources describe a wall of flame, people trampled in panic, and others returning to the ruins only to find nothing left. Nero was not in Rome when it started. He was at his villa in Antium. He rushed back to the city and threw himself into relief efforts, opening his own gardens to shelter the homeless, bringing in food from Ostia and slashing the price of grain. These are not the actions of a man who ordered the blaze. So where did the arson story originate? In the smoking ruins, a desperate rumor took hold. People whispered that they had seen men with torches preventing others from fighting the flames, and that these men claimed to be acting under orders. The emperor's grand plan for a new palace, the Domus Aurea, required a vast cleared space in the heart of the city. The timing was horribly convenient. While he likely did not start the fire, he certainly exploited its aftermath, seizing the devastated land for his golden house, a move that felt like a confession of guilt to a traumatized populace. To quell the growing anger, he needed a culprit. He found one in a secretive and unpopular group, the Christians. Their beliefs were misunderstood, their refusal to worship Roman gods seen as a threat to the state's divine favor. Tacitus, no friend to Christians, wrote that Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures. They were made into human torches, crucified or torn apart by beasts in his gardens. This first state-sponsored persecution was a masterstroke of political deflection, transforming public fury away from the emperor and onto a convenient minority. But it was a short-term fix. The fire, the golden house, and the horrific spectacle of the executions shattered any remaining illusion of the golden quinquennium. The Senate despised his artistic pretensions and his populist disregard for tradition. The people, once entertained by his games, now saw a ruler who built a pleasure palace over their ashes. The military lost respect. A vast conspiracy involving senators, knights, and even his own Praetorian Guard coalesced. When it was uncovered, the bloody purges that followed only deepened the isolation. Finally, abandoned and declared a public enemy by the Senate, Nero fled. He died by his own hand in a villa outside Rome, assisted by a loyal secretary. With his death, the direct line of Julius Caesar and Augustus, the Julio-Claudian dynasty, sputtered out. The fire did not just burn Rome, it incinerated the last vestiges of a founding family's legitimacy, leaving the empire to the whims of the army and the chaos of the year of the 4 emperors. The ultimate mystery of Nero is not whether he fiddled, but whether he was a uniquely evil monster or a tragically flawed artist prince whose worst instincts were magnified by catastrophe and whose legacy was written by the elite class he spent his life alienating. Nero's death plunged Rome into civil war, but centuries earlier and a world away, another empire rose with a startlingly different philosophy. Its founder understood that you cannot rule an entire world through terror alone. In the rugged highlands of ancient Persia, a leader emerged who would build the largest empire the world had yet seen, not just by the sword, but by a revolutionary idea, tolerance. His name was Cyrus II, known to history as Cyrus the Great. He began as the king of a small vassal state called Anshan, under the thumb of the mighty Median Empire. Through a combination of shrewd diplomacy and military innovation, he united the Persian tribes, rebelled against his Median overlord, and by the year 550 BC, he was the master of both peoples. But this was only the beginning. His true ambition lay in the wealthy, ancient civilizations to the west. The kingdom of Lydia, ruled by the famously rich King Croesus, fell next. Then Cyrus set his sights on the grand prize, the immense and ancient city of Babylon, the heart of Mesopotamian power. In the year 539 BC, his armies stood before its legendary, supposedly impregnable walls. According to the ancient historians, Cyrus did not lay a lengthy siege. Instead, he diverted the waters of the Euphrates River, which flowed through the city, allowing his troops to march along the riverbed and through the gates left open along the waterways. It was a brilliant tactical stroke, but what happened next was a masterstroke of political genius. He did not sack the city, he did not enslave its people or burn its temples. The Babylonian chronicles themselves record that his entry was peaceful, and that he was welcomed by the populace who were discontent with their own king. Cyrus then made his intentions astonishingly clear. He had a declaration written on a clay cylinder, now known as the Cyrus cylinder. In it, he proclaimed that he had come to Babylon as a liberator, not a conqueror. He condemned the previous Babylonian king for his oppression and claimed the blessing of the city's chief god, Marduk. He then ordered the restoration of temples across Mesopotamia and most famously allowed deported peoples to return to their homelands and rebuild their sanctuaries. This was not empty propaganda, it was a working policy. The most celebrated example involved the Jewish people who had been exiled to Babylon decades earlier. Cyrus issued an edict permitting them to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple, an act recorded with gratitude in the Hebrew Bible, where he is called the Lord's Anointed. This policy of cultural and religious tolerance was not born of soft-heartedness, but of breathtaking political insight. Cyrus ruled over an empire of countless languages, gods, and customs. He realized that trying to crush this diversity would create endless rebellion. Instead, he allowed people to keep their identities, their faiths, and their local administrators, so long as they remained loyal to the Persian crown and paid their taxes. This created stability, encouraged trade, and fostered a sense of inclusion in the vast imperial project. His capital, Pasargadae, reflected this ethos, incorporating architectural styles from all over his realm. Yet for all his fame, the end of Cyrus's story is shrouded in mystery. Ancient accounts say he died fighting nomadic tribes on his empire's northeastern frontier. His body was brought back to Pasargadae and placed in a simple, dignified stone tomb that still stands alone on the plain, a stark, gabled structure on a stepped platform. It is inscribed with a brief, powerful message in Old Persian. "O man, I am Cyrus, son of Cambyses, who founded the empire of the Persians and was king of Asia. Grudge me not therefore this monument, but is he still there? When Alexander the Great conquered Persia over 2 centuries later, he visited the tomb, finding it desecrated. He ordered it restored, showing a conqueror's reverence for the one who came before. Yet in the millennia since, the tomb has been robbed and repaired many times. No definitive archaeological evidence confirms his remains were ever inside, leaving us to wonder if the body of the tolerant king was lost to time, even as his revolutionary idea of governing a diverse world continues to echo. Cyrus presents us with a compelling counterpoint to the tyrants and zealots of history. He proved that immense power could be paired with respect, and that an empire's greatest strength might lie in the freedoms it granted, not the ones it crushed. That simple tomb still holds its secrets, but Cyrus left behind another monument, one made of clay and words. In 1879, during excavations in the ruins of Babylon, archaeologists uncovered a small, unassuming object, a baked clay cylinder about the size of a rugby ball. Its surface was covered in dense, wedge-shaped cuneiform script. This was the Cyrus cylinder, and its message would ripple across centuries. The text, written in Akkadian, tells the story of Cyrus's conquest from the perspective of the Babylonian priests. It describes the previous king, Nabonidus, as an impious ruler who oppressed his people and neglected the gods. Then it proclaims Cyrus as the chosen instrument of the chief god Marduk, who entered Babylon without a battle, greeted with joy. It details how Cyrus restored peace, returned statues of gods to their rightful cities, and allowed deported peoples to go back to their homelands. On its face, it is a stunning declaration of benevolent rule. But this immediately raises a profound historical question. Are we reading a genuine charter of human rights or a masterclass in political spin? The cylinder was almost certainly commissioned by Cyrus's own administration. It was found in the foundations of a Babylonian temple, a classic act of dedicatory propaganda meant to be seen by the gods and the priestly class, the very people whose support was crucial for maintaining control. Its language is a careful blend of Mesopotamian royal tradition and Persian ideology. designed to legitimize a foreign conqueror by fitting him into the local religious framework. It says all the right things to secure the loyalty of a restless, newly conquered population. So, is it just clever politics, perhaps, but the consequences were undeniably real. The cylinder's promises were not empty. The Jewish people did return to Jerusalem, as confirmed by the biblical books of Ezra and Isaiah. Other displaced groups were also resettled. The policy it announced was actually implemented, creating stability across a fractious empire. This moves it beyond mere propaganda into the realm of a governing principle, a revolutionary idea that stability comes from respect, not repression. The cylinder's modern life is just as fascinating as its ancient one. In the 1970s, the last Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, used it as a central symbol of his reign. He celebrated it as the world's first charter of human rights, linking his modern monarchy to the glorious tolerance of ancient Persia. It was toured internationally and copies were gifted to the United Nations. This was, of course, its own form of political theater, an attempt to burnish the image of an authoritarian regime with the glow of an ancient ideal. In 2006, the cylinder's significance was recognized globally when it was added to UNESCO Memory of the World Register. Today, it stands as a powerful paradox, an object of undeniable historical manipulation that nonetheless enshrined a concept so advanced it would take millennia to become a universal aspiration. Its very existence forces us to confront a messy truth about leadership, that the motives behind a noble act may be complex and calculated, but the act itself can still change the course of history, leaving a legacy far greater than the ruler ever intended. Cyrus built an empire on tolerance, but the Roman machine that followed often knew only one language: conquest. In the misty, green lands of Britannia, that language would be answered by a queen with a sword. Her name was Boudica, wife of Prasutagus, king of the Iceni tribe in what is now East Anglia. The Iceni were client allies of Rome, a status that offered a fragile autonomy so long as they paid tribute and kept the peace. When Prasutagus died around the year 60, he tried to protect his family and kingdom by leaving half his wealth to the Roman Emperor Nero and half to his two young daughters. It was a desperate attempt to buy security under Roman law. It failed catastrophically. Roman officials on the ground saw not a legal will but an opportunity. They declared the entire kingdom forfeit. The royal household was plundered. When Boudica, now the ruling queen, protested, she was publicly flogged. Her daughters were assaulted by Roman soldiers. This was not just a political annexation. It was a calculated act of humiliation designed to shatter Celtic pride and demonstrate absolute dominance. It had the opposite effect. It ignited a firestorm. Boudica united the Iceni and their neighbors, the Trinovantes, who were already seething under the weight of Roman taxes and the arrogance of retired legionaries who had stolen their land. She was a figure of terrifying charisma. Ancient historians describe her as tall, with a fierce gaze, a harsh voice, and a great mass of bright red hair falling to her hips. She rallied her warriors with a speech that cut to the heart of their grievance, asking why they, who so valued freedom, should pay for the very chains that bound them. Her rebellion was not a war of maneuver, but a hurricane of vengeance. Her first target was Camulogenum, modern Colchester. This was a colonia, a town for retired Roman soldiers, a symbol of occupation built on land taken from the Trinovantes. The town was poorly defended. The rebels showed no mercy, slaughtering every Roman and Roman sympathizer they found, tearing down the temple dedicated to the deified Emperor Claudius. A Roman legion rushing to the rescue was ambushed and annihilated. Emboldened, Boudica's forces, now numbering in the tens of thousands, swept south. The prosperous trading port of Londinium was next. Governor Suetonius Paulinus, returning from a campaign in Wales, reached the city but realized he could not defend it with his limited troops. He made the brutal, strategic decision to abandon it to save his army. London was burned to the ground, its inhabitants massacred. The same fate befell Verulamium, modern St. Albans, 3 cities utterly erased. The Roman historian Tacitus, our main source, writes that the British killed with a singular ferocity, taking no prisoners and granting no quarter. The body count was estimated at 70,000 Roman and provincial dead. Governor Suetonius Paulinus finally gathered his forces, the 14th and 20th legions, along with some auxiliaries, perhaps 10,000 men in total. He chose his battlefield with care, a narrow defile with dense woods at his back and an open plain in front. This protected his flanks and forced the massive British horde, with its families and supply wagons watching from the rear, to funnel into a frontal assault. Boudica, confident in her overwhelming numbers, charged. It was a slaughter, but not the one she envisioned. The disciplined Roman lines held, their javelins thinning the front ranks before they closed in with their short swords, fighting in tight formation. The British warriors, for all their courage, were no match for this mechanical efficiency. The battle became a rout, and the retreat was blocked by the very wagons of the British camp. Tacitus claims 80,000 Britons fell that day against only 400 Roman dead. Boudica's fate is the final mystery. Tacitus says she took poison to avoid capture. Another historian, Cassius Dio, claims she fell ill and died. Her grave has never been found. Did she choose a noble death like Cleopatra, or did she succumb to despair? Her rebellion was crushed, but it left a permanent scar. The Roman policy in Britain shifted toward slightly more conciliatory administration, a quiet admission that some spirits, once roused, could never be fully extinguished. Boudica's story forces a difficult question: does a rebellion need to succeed on the battlefield to truly win? She failed to drive Rome from Britain, yet she transformed herself from a victim of empire into its eternal, furious ghost, a symbol of resistance so powerful that even her conquerors felt compelled to write her name into history. The final confrontation was not just a clash of armies, but a collision of two worlds. Governor Suetonius Paulinus chose his ground with cold precision, somewhere along the Roman road known as Watling Street. The exact location is lost, but historians believe it was likely in the West Midlands, a place where a narrow defile with wooded slopes protected his flanks. This was the key to his victory. Boudica's force, swelling with tens of thousands of warriors and their families, possessed overwhelming numbers but required open ground to maneuver and use their chariots effectively. By funneling them into a frontal assault, Paulinus turned their greatest strength into a fatal weakness. The Britons charged with righteous fury, but they broke against the unyielding, disciplined lines of Roman legionaries, whose short swords and locked shields worked like a single, terrible machine. The retreat became a massacre, trapped by their own circled wagons. In a single afternoon, the rebellion was crushed, but the fate of the queen who led it slipped immediately into shadow. Our two main sources disagree. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing decades later, states simply that she poisoned herself. Cassius Dio, writing over a century after the event, says she fell sick and died. Both accounts serve a purpose. Poison suggests a noble, controlled end, a final act of defiance against capture and humiliation in a Roman triumph. Illness is less dramatic, perhaps softening the narrative for a Roman audience or reflecting a truth lost to time. Either way, her body vanished. The mystery of Boudica's grave is one of Britain's oldest. Without a tomb, she became a ghost in the landscape, claimed by countless locations. Some traditions place her burial mound under a platform at King's Cross Station in London. Others point to a hill fort in Norfolk or a secret barrow beneath Parliament Hill in London. The most persistent legend surrounds a site called Greyfriars in Norwich or a mound near Stonehenge. Each claimed grave reflects a community's desire to connect with her spirit, to literally ground the legend in their soil. This absence of fact became the fertile ground for a national myth. In the centuries that followed, particularly during the Renaissance and the Victorian era, Boudica was resurrected as a potent symbol. When Britain faced foreign threats from the Spanish Armada to the empires of Europe, she was recast as the original patriot, a mother defending her homeland against a tyrannical superpower. Her story, emphasizing resistance against overwhelming odds and a fierce love of liberty, resonated perfectly with the growing British identity. The lack of a definitive ending only amplified her power. She could not be contained by a single tomb or a final, documented moment. She exists in the space between history and legend, a figure whose true end is unknown, allowing every generation to find in her struggle a reflection of their own. Boudicca's rebellion was a firestorm of vengeance against an outside empire, but sometimes the most radical revolutions come from within. In the golden age of New Kingdom Egypt, a pharaoh emerged who would turn the entire spiritual order of his civilization upside down. His name was Amenhotep IV, but he would later rename himself Akhenaten, meaning effective for the Aten. His reign was not about expanding borders or crushing external enemies. It was about annihilating the gods themselves. For over 1,000 years, Egyptian religion was a complex, comforting tapestry woven with countless deities, from Osiris of the underworld to the mighty state god Amun-Ra. The priesthood of Amun, based in Thebes, had grown immensely wealthy and powerful, rivaling the authority of the pharaoh. Akhenaten's solution was not to fight this power structure, but to erase its very foundation. He declared that there was only one true god worthy of worship, the Aten, represented not as a man or animal, but as a radiant sun disk whose rays ended in tiny hands offering the Ankh, the symbol of life, to the royal family. This was monotheism in a polytheistic world, a theological earthquake. He didn't stop at theology, he enacted this vision in stone and sand. He ordered the construction of an entirely new capital city, built from scratch in a barren stretch of desert along the Nile, a place he called Akhetaten, horizon of the Aten, known today as Amarna. He moved his court, his administration, and his people to this isolated site, physically breaking from the old power centers and their entrenched priests. The art he commissioned in this new city broke every convention. For centuries, Egyptian art was formal, stiff, and idealized, meant to represent the eternal order. Akhenaten's artists created something shockingly naturalistic. The pharaoh himself was depicted with a strangely elongated face, full lips, a slender neck, a rounded belly, and wide hips. His wife, the legendary Nefertiti, was shown with a graceful, almost surreal beauty. Scenes of the royal family appeared intimate and human. They are shown kissing, playing with their children, bathed in the rays of the Aten in a display of tender, daily devotion never before seen in royal iconography. This was a deliberate propaganda campaign, showing that divine favor flowed only through the king and queen to the people. But what truly drove him was Akhenaten, a visionary prophet, the world's first monotheist, experiencing a genuine divine revelation. Or was he a ruthless political strategist, using a new god to dismantle the rival priesthood of Amun and consolidate absolute power solely in the hands of the pharaoh? The evidence points to a potent, dangerous mix of both. His focus was so intensely on his god and his new city that foreign affairs and the empire's frontiers seem to have been neglected, as diplomatic letters from this period, the Amarna letters, reveal growing anxiety from Egyptian vassals. For the average Egyptian, the upheaval must have been terrifying. The local gods who governed harvests, childbirth, and the afterlife were suddenly forbidden. The familiar temples were closed, their festivals ceased. The economic network that supported thousands of priests, artisans, and laborers tied to the old cults collapsed. Society was uprooted and forced to follow a king whose sole focus was a distant, abstract sun disk accessible only through himself and his queen. It was a top-down revolution that touched every aspect of life, leaving a people spiritually adrift in the blinding light of a single, exclusive truth. Akhenaten's revolution was a family affair, its radiant core the royal household bathed in the Aten's rays, but the identities within that intimate circle are a historical puzzle box. His great royal wife, Nefertiti, remains one of ancient Egypt's most famous and elusive figures. Her stunning bust, found at Amarna, gives us a face of serene, almost otherworldly beauty, but her origins are obscure. She was likely a noblewoman, possibly even a relative of Akhenaten. During the height of the Amarna period, her power visibly grew. She is depicted in art performing roles traditionally reserved for the pharaoh alone, smiting enemies and making offerings to the Aten. This has led to a compelling theory that in the latter years of Akhenaten's reign, Nefertiti was elevated to co-regent, ruling alongside him under a new throne name, Neferneferuaten. This would make her a female pharaoh, a rare and powerful position directly involved in enforcing the sun god's worship. The family mystery deepens with the children and the chaotic succession. Akhenaten and Nefertiti had 6 daughters. The royal line seemed secure through them, but the throne required a male heir. This is where the boy King Tutankhamun enters the story. For decades, his parentage was a grand mystery. Recent genetic testing on his mummy and others from the period provides a likely answer. He was almost certainly the son of Akhenaten, but his mother was not Nefertiti. The DNA suggests his mother was a sister of Akhenaten, one of the many daughters of the previous pharaoh, Amenhotep III. This practice of royal incest was not uncommon, meant to keep the sacred bloodline pure. So Tutankhaten, as he was originally named, was a product of the very royal family his father had tried to spiritually isolate. Between Akhenaten's death and Tutankhamun's ascent, the historical record becomes a blur of confusing names. 2 shadowy figures appear to have ruled, perhaps briefly. One is Smenkhkare, a mysterious co-regent or successor, whose relationship to Akhenaten is unclear, possibly a brother or another son. The other is the ruler known as Ankh-Khepri Neferneferuaten. Many scholars now believe this was Nefertiti herself, ruling as pharaoh after her husband's death, using this formal name before perhaps changing it again. The court at Amarna was crumbling, the empire fraying at the edges, and these short reigns suggest a desperate struggle to maintain the Atenist regime without its founding prophet. They failed. The reaction against Akhenaten's revolution was total and vicious. After the Amarna line ended, the traditional priesthoods of the old gods, especially the powerful cult of Amun, staged a monumental comeback. The new pharaohs, beginning with Tutankhamun, who changed his name to honor Amun, and his successors Ai and Horemheb, embarked on a systematic campaign of damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. Akhenaten was declared a heretic. His city of Akhetaten was abandoned, its stone buildings dismantled for use elsewhere. His names and images were chiseled off monuments and temple walls. References to the Aten were erased. The goal was to purge him from history itself, to make it as if the sun disk and its radical king had never risen. For over 3,000 years, they largely succeeded. Akhenaten vanished, a footnote in the king lists, and Nefertiti faded into a beautiful rumor. His resurrection began with the spade and the trowel. In the late 19th century, archaeologists began excavating the desert site of Amarna, uncovering the outlines of the ghost city and its distinctive art. Then, in 1922, Howard Carter's discovery of the nearly intact tomb of Tutankhamun provided a seismic clue. While the boy king's burial was hastily adapted back to traditional forms, many items within it bore the erased cartouches of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. A simple box, for instance, showed the young Tutankhaten and his wife, who was also his half-sister, under the rays of the Aten. These were artifacts from the Amarna court, spared the erasure because they were hidden in the tomb. They were silent witnesses to a family and a faith that the state had tried to obliterate. So we are left to wonder, did the priests who erased Akhenaten understand that in trying so completely to destroy his memory, they were ensuring his mystery would one day captivate the world far more than 1,000 orthodox pharaohs ever could? These lives, separated by continents and centuries, are bound by invisible threads of staggering ambition. Each one reached for a new order, whether it was a unified empire, a moral code, a single god, or simply personal glory beyond all limits. Their impacts were transformative, etching borders, belief systems, and words into the bedrock of civilization itself. Yet around every one of them swirls a permanent cloud of mystery, a fog woven from lost evidence, biased storytellers, and the sheer passage of millennia. We know Caesar crossed the Rubicon, but we debate whether he was a savior or a tyrant. We marvel at Alexander's conquests, but we cannot find his body. We read Ashoka's edicts of peace, yet we question the sincerity of his conversion. These are not failures of history, but its essential condition. The record is always written by the victors, the survivors, or the next dynasty with a story to sell. What was Cleopatra's final whispered word? What secret lies sealed in the first emperor's Mercury tomb? The answers are gone, and in their absence we find something more powerful than fact, the space for legend. Our own fascination with power and personality rushes into that void, shaping these figures into archetypes, monsters, saints, and tragic heroes for every new generation. Perhaps, then, it is not the solid achievements that grant immortality, but the haunting, unanswered questions, the how, the why, the where that we can never fully know. These mysteries invite us in, turning us from passive listeners into active detectives across time, forever piecing together the fragments of a shattered mirror, each shard reflecting a different truth. So we leave you with one final thought to ponder. Of all these ancient leaders whose unresolved story intrigues you the most, is it the lost tomb, the contested motive, the enigmatic final act? Share your choice in the comments below and let the investigation continue. For more deep dives into the enigmas that shape our world, be sure to subscribe.